How's it going, everyone? I am Dylan. This is my cousin Carlo. This is All You Can Board. And we're back for another Own It, Play It, Skip It. I think this is like episode 7 or 8. I'm going to stop counting because I just can't keep track. But we've done a lot of them. It's a popular series. We love doing them. We're going to look at 6 games today, 3 each, and we're each going to rank them as whether we think that our final verdict from the plays we've had would be Own It. It needs to be in your collection. Play It. You need to play it, but you don't actually have to physically own it. Or skip it entirely and maybe not one you want to check out.
Well, it's almost more whether it's an own it, play it, skip it for us.
Yes.
Because if I say this polyomino game is an own it and you hate polyomino games, I'm not telling you to go buy it.
Well, you are.
It's just, I think these own it, play it, skip it videos are interesting because we look at these from a more ownership perspective, and I think that the more you're familiar with our channel, the more you're familiar with our tastes, the more value these videos and these reviews have, because you can say, hey, I know Carlo likes these types of games, but this one was only a play it. Maybe I'll default and wait for one of the own its instead, kind of thing. So.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw it to you to kick this off.
All right. So the first game we are going to be talking about today is a game that I actually talked about kind of recently on the channel in a different video, and this is Café. So this is a very small box card game. It's co-designed by, I believe it's Rola e Costa, a couple of Portuguese designers. I'd never played anything by them before, published by Pythagoras. This is a 1 to 4 player engine building game. It's kind of a tableau builder as well. Basic idea is it plays over 8 rounds and you are drafting cards. Every round there's going to be a certain number of cards out on the table that get flipped from the deck. And based like one more than the number of players. All you're going to do is you're going to pick a card, put it into your tableau. You have to choose where it goes. But the interesting thing in this game is all the cards have these 6 quadrants, like 6 squares. And you start off with one in your tableau, and anytime you add a new card, you have to cover up minimum 2 squares of another card. So you're overlaying cards the whole time. You're kind of breaking and modifying your engine, covering up valuable spaces that you used the turn before to now go in a different direction. So you're kind of modifying as you go. And yeah, every round is just draft a card, decide where it goes, and then take a number of actions based on the number of coffee cup symbols you have on your cards. Play 8 rounds of that and the game is done. Very simple, and throughout your rounds, the goal is that you're going through the 4 kind of stages of coffee production. So you start with step A, which is producing the beans, step B is drying them, step C is roasting, and then finally is delivering or selling them. So you can either get like shops in your little area that needs certain types of coffee delivered to them when you sell them, or you can just send that coffee to your warehouse and you have different types of coffee. Very interesting game. I've only played it solo and 2 players, but I've gotten about 10 plays of this in now, and I held off on covering this in a more like review type fashion for a bit on the channel because first off, undeniably there's a little bit of bias here because we're Portuguese. Also that I love coffee, but like, a game that was true, like this company is situated in Portugal, Portuguese designers, like everyone who works for the company as far as I know is Portuguese, so there's a bit of bias there for sure. So I kept thinking, is it just the bias or do I really like this game? And I kept playing it solo, and I really, really like this game. So before we go any further, I will say, this is an own it for me. If this game, like there's a few things that could have easily made it fall just into kind of like the play category. If it took up way more way more space on the shelf, if it was a more expensive game, if it was an easier game, I think that's the biggest thing for me why it's an own it is it's kind of a multiplayer solitaire game. So a lot of the time these games where you're not really, like the only interaction is basically if you take a card that your opponent might have wanted when they're going to draft. That's literally the only thing. You don't compare, you're not competing to fulfill orders and like everything you do is in front of you. So normally when you have these multiplayer kind of solitaire games, a lot of the time it feels to me, and ones especially you can play solo, it's like once you do really well or you beat the target score or whatever, you kind of feel like, I'm kind of done with the game.
Right.
And so a lot of games, like I talked about Friday recently, it didn't take that many plays for me to beat the kind of like hardest mode. And then I kind of feel like, well, why am I going to go back to it? And this, even after playing it 2 players and solo multiple times, like I have games where I feel like I'm doing so well, I'm doing really well. I get to the end of the game and I'm like, 28 points? Like, what? And like I think the highest target score that says like you got an excellent score is like 46 or 50 or something. And I'm like, I think the highest I've got is like 32, and I just keep feeling like, how am I like, and that's what draws me back to games the most, is when I feel like I'm either bad at a game or have this, like there's still so much left to learn or discover about it. Yeah. That's what's going to pull me in and make it worth owning. So and again, the other thing is, if this didn't have a solo mode, I don't know if I would say it's an own just for the 2-player, but the solo mode, the fact that the expansion comes right in the box, which just adds in a few cards with a few extra symbols, it just puts it over the top. for like a $22 game, you really can't go wrong. Yeah, there's a lot of replay value. I love Café. It's a great game.
Yeah, I actually own this one as well.
Yeah.
I've only played it a couple times. I played a lot less than you, but I really, really like this game. The two things that stand out to me is one, the integration of the theme is surprisingly good. Like, I don't want to say surprisingly good, like how you go and expect it not to be implemented well, but there's using a theme like coffee or whatever, and then there's actually like finding a way in a small game that just involves cards for this price to actually say, wow, like the thematic of like this is the process of making coffee or the beans, whatever.
It's
like,
just cards and 4 colors of cubes. It's so
it
like
works
component wise, it's simple.
Yeah, and then obviously the overlaying of cards. It's what I love in Smartphone Inc., which we recently started playing, and I love it here too. Is just that decision making of you have to cover certain things up, and you know it's done differently here, but that system is still just super attractive to me, and I just really, really enjoy it. And again, the fact that this plays so quickly is just an extra bonus too, because you can throw down multiple games in a single sitting, or it can be like a filler game that you're playing, before, after big game, or just squeezing it at any point in the night. Like you can always get this to the table.
Yeah.
So having it as an own makes sense because you're probably going to get a lot of value out of it. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great pick.
Yeah, thank you. That is Café. Highly recommend you check it out. It's not super easy to find, but yeah, great game.
All right, game I'm going to take a look at here is a game called Roam, and this is from Red Raven Games and Ryan Lockett. The first thing that stood out to me for this this game that made me want to pick it up is, so many of Ryan Lockett's games and the games that come out of Red Raven Games are these like story-driven, narrative-driven, grand-looking or feeling games like Sleeping Gods and Above and Below, Near and Far, all that kind of stuff. And this is a small box game, and I thought, interesting because the artwork right away strikes you as something where if you look at this, you'd be like, oh, this might be a narrative game, or this might be a campaign game.
But you're like, but where does the giant storybook fit into the box?
Exactly, right? Yeah. So that was just super interesting to me when I realized that. I'm like, I just want to know what compelled him to make a smaller game and how he was still able to inject the things he loves about the way he makes board games into it. And so I think I went in a little bit skeptical, like, is it going to have that same feel that makes the other games look so amazing and make them so popular? And the most surprising thing to me about this is not even to do with the gameplay. It's the fact that there's still an injection of like lore and theme and characters and everything with like...
That was surprising.
Yeah, like the way that you get characters, and when you get them, they give you new abilities to engage with on the main board, but you have basically recovered these characters from the world that you're playing in, and it has like a little blurb about them and everything. Like they're actually, you learn about these characters as you go, and I imagine that the more you play, you can start to remember certain names or like which ones have really good abilities, and I'll get to what those abilities are in a second, but where you're like, oh, there he is, like it's Frank or whatever. That's not the name, but you know what I mean, like you'd be like, oh man, I can't believe you got Frank this game, whatever.
Yeah.
Like
I feel like every time we read off one of the cards, we were both sitting there smiling, going like,
yeah,
oh, that's pretty cool. Like even if it didn't have anything on the gameplay, it's like it is pulling you into the world a bit.
Yeah. And basically what you're doing in this game is it is this like area control style or area majority style game where you have these main terrain cards in the center of the board. Each of them I think has 6 or 8 spots that you can place your little tokens on, and you start with 3 character cards in front of you, and each character can place tokens in a certain way. So this one might be it places it in a straight line, this one might be it places it in a little mini L shape, and that is how you're going to place tokens on the board, but you have to place it in that exact orientation. You cannot rotate or anything like that. So if it's blocked by other pieces, opponent's pieces, you're skipping those spots, which means you're placing less, you're less effective with your character's abilities. You're going to start with very basic ways to place tokens, but the area majority that you're essentially doing on these cards, those cards flip over and become characters that have more effective ways of placing tokens. So you've essentially scoured that location, turned it over, found the character you've uncovered, added him to your supply, and now you have more ways to engage with the board. It's a really fun and addictive mechanism to keep going back to say, I want to get, power myself up and get these interesting characters to be more effective on the board, and certain shapes are going to be more effective also depending on what your opponents have acquired as well, because you know how they're going to be engaging with the board, and you have to look at it as like, if this person's sitting here at the table, they're going to engage with their pieces in that orientation. They can't spin them either, so that comes into play as well. It's a really interesting game, and I always really appreciative of small box area controller area majority games. It's something I've realized I just really love is when you have a genre that normally, I think I mentioned this before, normally I used to always associate with experiences like Blood Rage or Inish and
or even
like
Risk
that.
Before we got into like more modern games,
like longer, more involved games. When you have small games that can kind of incorporate elements like that, like whether it be something as small as Rome or medium size like Ethnos or whatever, it's just so attractive to me because I realize I really love that genre, but I don't often have like 3 hours to sit down to play. I love Rising Sun.
Or if we do, a lot of the time the other people we're playing with haven't played that game.
Exactly.
And the idea of a teach and a first time and then not playing for months again or whatever.
Bingo. Yeah, so Rome to me right away was attractive, and I played it. I really enjoyed it. It is not quite an own for me. I don't think that if I had to choose, I'd be choosing Ethnos over Rome still, just because I enjoy the gameplay of Ethnos, even though I would love to have this kind of artwork on Ethnos.
Oh, yeah. Ryan Lockett, yeah.
Oh, man, Ryan Lockett. Do a new updated version of Ethnos, and I will be the first one to pre-order that.
I could be wrong. Like, it's kind of crazy that he does, I think for all of them, if not all of them, most, but I'm pretty sure he does the artwork for all of his own games. And I don't know if he does artwork for anyone else's games. He's like, no, my art is for my games only. So I don't think he's going to go,
this is going to be a play for me. It's not quite an own, but it is a game that I think you should definitely check out, and I think your enjoyment of it is going to depend on how much you enjoy area like majority type games, area control games, but and also what other ones you already have in your collection. If you already have a small one, maybe like a smaller experience like that, maybe this isn't one that's you're gonna feel the need to have in your collection. But I think just the injection of narrative and story and lore and artwork in this style of game in a small box package like this is just so unique, and it's novel compared to a lot of things I have in my collection that it's just shy, I would say, of an own.
Cool. I don't have a whole lot, at least, of substance to add to this because I've only played this with you once. It was probably at least 4 or 5 months ago. It was quite some time ago. And we only played it together as a 2-player game, which I imagine is the case with almost every area majority games. It's not ideal with 2. So for me, I was bordering, if you had forced me to say player skip now, I'd be bordering between a player skip. But again, I played it at the less than ideal count. So what I want to ask you is, for anyone watching, would your own player skip change at all if anyone was looking for it as a specifically 2-player game?
Not for me. I actually really enjoyed it as a 2-player game, and I think that's also kind of what attracted me to it even more, is the fact that it's often hard for an area control area majority type game to be effective at 2 players.
Yeah, for sure.
And I actually thought Rome was. I actually thought it was. I had a lot of fun with it, and it didn't. From playing with 2 players, I didn't finish that experience and think, oh, I had the lesser experience of Rome. I actually felt like I really enjoyed it. I could just see like, oh yes, with more competition out here, it's definitely going to add some interest and it's going to be more cutthroat. But at 2, I still had tons of fun with it, and I think that's sometimes hard to do with this genre. So that was actually part of what attracted me to it. I don't think that would change my verdict at all.
Cool. All right. Well, I'd be open to trying it again. I'm curious to try with 3 or 4, but it's going to have to be someone else who suggests it.
That is Rome.
All right. Next up, I'm going to be talking about a game that I don't have the physical copy of, but I've played a lot of on Board Game Arena recently, and that is Sobek 2 Players. Right?
Oh, you're gonna
box match this again. Wait, did you animate it last week?
I did.
Oh, yeah, okay. I got.
You're asking.
I can't remember now.
You didn't even appreciate what I did, and you just did it again. You could have just gone like this, and I didn't have to animate anything.
Sobek 2 Player. This is co-designed by Bruno Cathala and Sébastien Pochon. He's the guy who did Jaipur. So there was a game called Sobek that came out, I think it was in 2010, by Bruno Cathala. I never tried that version. That was a 2 to 4 player game, and now this is the 2-player only version. So the basic idea is there's a grid of tiles. I can't remember what it is. It's like a 6x6 or 8x8 or something, but kind of a square grid with a bunch of tiles on the board. The tiles are either different kinds of goods, like fish, ivory, whatever. There's wild tokens or tiles, and then there's also these character tiles, and the character tiles are face down. You just see kind of like a red character on the back of all of them, and you only get to, when you take the tile into your supply behind your little private screen or whatever, you get to flip it over and see what you have. So you'll know your opponents have characters, but you don't know which ones, and they're all unique. So basic idea is there's this little token, I think it's called the Ankh piece or whatever, that's in the middle, and it basically has how would I say this? Sort of arrows in two directions opposite of each other.
Yeah.
And it basically determines which direction you can pick tiles from on your turn. So on your turn, if the Ankh token is pointing left to right, you can only pick tiles from that axis. And then whichever tile you pick, let's say you jump, and there's no restriction, you can jump over other tiles. If you jump over tiles to pick one, the ones you jumped over you gain and they go into your corruption pile, which at the end of the game, whoever has the most corruption tokens is going to get a certain amount of negative points. All the tiles in the game, though, have these little kind of sort of shaded markers on opposite ends, again, on either the sides or the corners, telling you that when you pick the tile, that tile that you take, where those shaded markers are, is going to determine where that Ankh token now points. So every turn is a decision of which tile am I going to take, what am I potentially grabbing as corruption, but also which options am I going to be leaving for my opponent now. Yep. So one thing that really, like one game that really reminded me of it, the way the rules actually work, it doesn't, but in that sense of I have full control over which options I'm leaving for my opponent, it reminded me a lot of Targi, which is a game that you and I have talked about that we've only played on Board Game Arena once or twice, but neither of us really enjoyed it all that much. Yeah. Even though I think we both appreciated that it's like, the design makes sense, it works well, it just kind of felt a bit dry for us.
Yeah.
Sobek 2-player for me felt like a much more interesting, fun version of that kind of, because it has the room for the meanness that Targi has, but there's also room for more interesting plays and just more like the stuff with the characters that you get is really cool. There can be a bit of a barrier with teaching a new player because if you know the characters really well and they don't, you're going to have a big advantage. Like, even I think, I shouldn't. No, you know what? We're in a game of it async right now. I was going to bring up a character, but then you're going to know that I'm holding that character. And so never mind. But the point is, and then the game, as you're taking tiles, the board's going to dwindle down, and then there's a point where it refreshes once, and then when it gets depleted a certain amount the second time, the game's going to end. The scoring with the goods works very similar as King Domino. Obviously, same. Bruno Cathala just brought that in terms of the tiles all have 1, 2, or 3 of these scarabs on them, and how many. So you're doing the set collection thing where you can choose: do I want to move the tile or the token on my turn and pick up a tile, or do I want to spend this turn leaving the token where it is, which might make my opponent's turn tougher, and instead I'm going to spend this turn just cashing in tokens. So there's that set collection aspect. The scores can be all over the place. I've had games where I've like won or lost by like 60, 70 points. So if that's something that bothers you, if you want your games to be really close, this game can have wild swings. Ultimately, this one is a play it for me. If I was leaning more to one direction, it would definitely lean way more towards own than play. It just comes up a bit shy for me because I didn't have that kind of like burning desire to go back to it again and again. I think now that I've played it probably upwards of 7, 8 times, like if I didn't play it for a while longer, I'd be totally fine with that. The fact that it's on Board Game Arena as well, you can try it for free. I just don't think it's ever going to be one of my like top 5 or top 10 like kind of go-to 2-player games. So I think if I had tried this, earlier in my sort of
board game career,
whatever you want to call it, and I'd played fewer games, I might be like, oh, this is like one of my favorite 2-player games. But yeah, it's just sort of outside my favorites, so it's a play it, but one that I like highly recommend almost everyone try out because it's quick and it's fairly easy to get into.
Yeah.
And lots of interesting decisions to make.
Yeah, the game we're playing now is the first time I've ever played it, so I don't have, like, I can talk about it, but I'm very limited in my scope here. But I'm really, really enjoying it, and I don't know why I kind of didn't think I would like it, or I never really thought much of it, but the artwork I really like. I just like the fun, playful artwork, and it's really colorful and everything like that. But the actual gameplay, like the turns are so lightning quick, which is something I really appreciate in especially 2-player only games where you can just kind of like go back and forth and there's very little downtime for either player. Really love that. And then the decision of which tiles you're going to select and whether or not you're going to take corruption, but also, like you said, where you're going to leave the Ankh for your opponent to be able to choose as well, is even just from our first game, the amount of times I've like been like, oh, this is perfect, I'm gonna take this, then I'm like, wow, I'm leaving him with a lot of options though, right? Like, you do have to weigh that, and even though I imagine you're not gonna like forego giving yourself a really good tile just because you're leaving your opponent with options, it is going to be a decision maker sometimes, especially if you can find another move to do that you're like, oh, but this would leave him with less. Or the amount of times that you've trapped me somewhere, or not the amount, like a couple times that you trapped me somewhere where you left it, I was like, well, I have very little choices. It's like I imagine that was intentional, right?
Yeah,
like, it's really interesting for such a simple design, and the scoring that, like you said, has come from King Domino. It's just it's a really effective mechanic, and it's something that works so well in King Domino, and it works well here, and as well as you're gathering.
And the other thing I should have mentioned is that if the game ends and you have a bunch of tiles in your hand that you didn't take, you have to take a turn to cash them in. So like, let's say you have 3 big sets of tiles in your hand, and the game's getting near the end. You're like, I might only get 2 more turns. I might not even be able to cash in this set of like 20 some points. So you never know when the game's going to end based on when people refresh the market and stuff. So there is a lot of interesting stuff to consider here. And I should add this: if I was primarily 2-player, like if most of my gaming was 2 players, I'd probably be calling this an own it right now, because I'd be playing 2-player games more often, that it would make it into my regular rotation. Right. So again, I really think it's a great game. I highly recommend it. It's just outside of an own it for me, so that's a play it. And again, it's Sobek 2-player.
Nice.
And that's from Pandasaurus Games, I believe.
Yes.
Wish I had a physical copy.
You're correct.
Sobek 2 players.
All right. Then the game I'm going to take a look at now is a game we've talked about before. We played it at the cabin, and that is Fyfe. So Fyfe is from Pegasus Spiel, and it's designed by Kosh. And it is
This must be Kosh's first game.
Yeah, I think it is. And this, I'm going to say, has been one of the most delightful surprises for me in 2022. Right off the bat, because I feel like it's part of the surprise of this is actually going to be an own for me, which I didn't think this was. Even when I was interested in it, even when we received it, I thought I was going to like it. I was interested in the game. I talked about it before it even came out. Like, it was something I wanted to check out, but it's never something that struck me as like, oh, this is like, this is going to be a great, like something I want to come back to multiple. I was kind of interested in it. It's never going to be a game that makes it onto my top 50. It's never going to be, one of my favorite games, but the reason it's an own is that it is this game that has the same kind of effect as like Savannah Park, where you have your own board, you're doing your own thing, but everyone around the table, at least in the experiences I've had, is having so much fun with the puzzly nature of it and having to figure things out. And there's just enough player interaction to not have it feel like, oh, we all just kind of like sat around doing our own thing and didn't interact with each other, because you're racing to see who can complete certain scoring objectives first. And so if all of a sudden I see that my opponent over here, say I'm playing 3 players, my opponent across the table grabs this scoring objective and starts going for it, that's going to now incentivize me to go, do I want to challenge them fair, let them get the bonus for being the first one to complete that? Or am I already going for that, and now I see that they're competing, and now I have to start thinking, okay, I need to complete this quicker, because otherwise you can complete objectives at your own pace. Really, the only reason to complete them quicker is because your opponents are going for them. So what this game is you have this board of 25 open spots in front of you. They all fit these circular tiles. You have 2 tiles in your supply at all times, and you're drawing a new tile every turn after you place one, and you're just placing one of these tiles into one of these spots. Your tile is going to be of 1 of 5 colors, 1 of 5 symbols, and 1 of 5 numbers. So there's multiple combinations of those things, and all the scoring objectives go on the outside of the board, pointing to one of these horizontal or vertical or diagonal rows. And the scoring objectives could say you have to have this entire column go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or this one has to be all 5 numbers, but it doesn't matter what order they're in. Or the hardest objective is you have to have 1 of every color, 1 of every number, and 1 of every symbol on it, which is really hard to complete, but it gives you the most points. I think it's like 18 or something.
And some of them you have ones in specific orders, like this symbol, then that symbol, then that symbol, like very specific.
Or the full house effect, where it's like 3 of one number, 2 of another number. Like, there's all these different scoring conditions, and they all start off your board, and you have to add a scoring condition onto your board if you ever place a tile and there's no scoring condition like connected to that spot at all. But if there already is, you don't have to add a scoring condition, and you can also add as many as you want. So really, you have so much freedom in how you go for things and when you kind of reveal your hand and what you're doing to your opponents, because you're not often looking at everyone's board being like, oh, I'm imagining he's going for this, because you're doing so much focus on your own board already. But because of the puzzly nature of it, and because it's so engaging to kind of manage your own board, and it's so easy to teach and understand, but there's so much depth there, this is one that I'm basically calling it an own, less because it's going to be like one of my favorite games, and more because I think it's going to hit the table very often for me. Yeah. The first game I played with two of my friends that I've only played board games with like a couple times, and they don't play board games very often. and both of them had such a good time with it. One of them, my friend Rolly, who's a teacher, that trying to puzzle out, the math of the odds and all that kind of stuff. Like he was just engrossed in it, and it's infectious a little bit around the table when you see everyone having so much fun with it. And even when we play at the cabin, I think like I was having that same feeling from realizing that you were enjoying it more than I was expecting as well.
I was totally surprised by this game. Yeah.
So I want to stress, like, this is not an own as in the sense of like, oh, you're gonna see this in my top 50 this year. I can almost guarantee you probably won't, or if it does, it'll barely be squeezing in there. It's more just that, like, this is a really effective game to have in your collection from my perspective. Like, you can bring this out in many situations, you can teach it very easily, you can have a lot of fun with it, and there's tons of incentive to come back and variety to come back to play it different. I didn't even mention the special abilities that you can use. And
the special abilities are one of the more interesting things about the game, I think.
And not using them gets you points, but you're giving up points to potentially get more points for using them,
it's that
like,
trade-off of, am I sacrificing, can I make up the points I'm losing by making a bigger play, and when do I use those? Because if I don't use them early enough, I'm going to run out of time before the game ends.
And on top of all that, like, great artwork, great table presence, great components. You have a dual layered player board. The tiles are super satisfying.
I was going to say the feel of those tiles, and they've got like the nice artwork on both sides of them and everything. It's a really satisfying game to play. Tactile, like,
it is a surprising game for me, and it's hard to. It was hard for me to rate it because, like I said, it's not. I want to stress, it's not going to be like one of my favorite games, but it's effective at what it does. Like, it's going to be one that stays in my collection for a while because I will always find opportunities to play it.
I hear you, and I think we were both almost wondering the same. Even when we did our video where we were recapping our cabin games, where this made it at number like 5 or 6 for the weekend. I think we were also both. Not like we didn't want to give people the wrong impression that we're like, this isn't necessarily better than all the games below on the list, but like there's just something really welcoming and satisfying about playing it. Just hits a real sweet spot. It's just I might end up even getting my own copy of this one day just because like I feel like I would see a lot of play. And this is the type of game too. If there was an app or a digital version of this, I feel like this is even if it was just against AI, against bots, like this is one of those games you could get totally just addicted to online. Just play game after game digitally. This
would be a very effective BGA game.
BGA, or get an app out there. Like I guarantee people will get hooked on this.
Yeah, that is Fyfe, and that is an Own It.
Yeah, and again, if that is a debut designer, like that's a heck of a debut. Mm-hmm. All right, the last game I'm going to be reviewing here today is a game I've spoken about, I think, a couple times on the channel before, at least once for sure, and that is Faiyum. So this is designed by Fyfe and Roam, the sometimes known as the Mad Scientist.
Is that what he's known as?
Well, kind of. I mean, he's got like he dyes his hair green. All of his games are green. All of his games always start with the letter F. He's got always these very interesting, kind of like his designs feel like something a mad scientist would have come up with. Like, man, quick side note: if you don't know about the game 504 by Fyfe and Roam, just 504, just go look it up. We'll talk about it in a video some other day on the channel. One of the most interesting games probably ever designed by this mad scientist.
And if you didn't hear me talk about Fancy Feathers in the previous video, look that game up and look at the box art, and that pretty much tells you all you need to know about this designer.
Exactly. So his designs are often kind of seen as like brilliant, unique ideas. They're often slightly flawed. Maybe there's balance issues. Who really knows? But he does a lot of stuff that other designers don't do. Another sort of one of his trademarks is that he always enlists, I think it's Harold Lieske, if I'm not mistaken, to do his art. And it always looks like the game came from the 80s or 90s. And this is a fairly new game. This was a 2020 game. So just so you know, despite the old artwork. So this plays 1 to 5 players. And it's sort of, if you're familiar with the way that the card system works in games like Concordia or the Century games, where you start off with a base, everyone starts with a base of hand of cards, and you get to basically, on your turn, you play a card, comes back around to you, either play a card, whatever, and then eventually you take a turn to basically just, sort of like a rest action where you just get your cards back. That's kind of the flow of this game. So sometimes they're considered deck builders, sometimes they're considered like hand builders. One of the really interesting things about, well, there's a couple of interesting things about this game. The first I'll say is the board. You're basically working to please the pharaoh. And so everything that gets placed on the board, if I play a card that lets me build a road or I build a settlement or whatever, once it's on the board, that belongs to the pharaoh. It doesn't belong to me. I don't have pieces of my own color. All the pieces are just general colors from the supply because everything that gets built, other players can use. So maybe I have cards that give me points every time that I build settlements. Maybe you have cards that you can build towns on top of those settlements. So the more settlements I'm creating on the board is creating more opportunities for you. But now someone else has a card that every 2 settlements to connect by roads gets them points. So now they're using your settlements to connect their roads. So everyone's kind of looking at the way that this organic map is developing every game and trying to figure out, there's a market of cards to buy that's rotating out, and there's a massive deck of cards. I think there's like 60 some unique cards, and they always come out in different orders. So the whole game is trying to look at what's available in the market, how is this kind of land developing, what belongs to the pharaoh, and trying to figure out where to go with your cards, what cards to buy, what synergies. And sometimes you find a combo and then you're just taking turns playing that combo over and over, recycling it, but then sometimes your combo dries up. Your opponents see what you're doing and they think, we got to stop building settlements so you can do this, we got to stop doing this, and suddenly you're having to shift and leave these cards down on the table and find other combos. So the other thing I wanted to mention that I find really interesting about the is when you get your cards back, you can only take back the top 3 from your discard pile. Anything below those 3, you have to pay $1 to take the next top card and the next top. So if you play a card too early and then you keep playing cards on top, you're going to bury it underneath your pile. All kinds of interesting stuff going on in this game. For a while, I kept thinking, I want to play this with 4 or 5 players before I review it on the channel and stuff. I've only played this at 3 players, and again, it plays 1 to 5. I'm not interested in trying it solo, and I don't think it'd be particularly good with 2. I imagine it's going to be best at the highest player counts. I think BGG says it's best at 4 or 5. So I can't really speak on comparing the player counts, but I decided to cover this today because I am 100% confident that if I play this with 4 or 5, this is still going to be an own it for me. And the reason is that there's just so much to explore with these card combos. I remember just seeing these cards, and sometimes you don't pick up cards quick enough and they go to the discard pile. You see someone else playing a card and you think, oh man, if I could have had that card with this one. You're like, okay, well maybe next time I play. And there's a couple barriers. It's not a perfect game. The 2 main issues I would say are that the game takes a bit longer than I'd like. And again, we've only played, the first time we played it, it was all 3 of us playing for the first time. And the second time we were kind of refreshing on rules. And the other thing is that glossary, right? All the iconography, half the time you play the first time, you're going to be looking at that glossary. What does that symbol mean? What does that symbol mean? Later on, you'll look up a card and it says, same as card 5, but also this ability. So you kind of learn it as you go. But there's a bit of that barrier. But the reason why this ends up being an own it is that there aren't many games that give you a feel of a medium to medium plus weight strategy game that give you that kind of more meaty game that have a simple kind of 3-4 page rule set. And I always talk about on the channel how there's too many of these heavy games where I'm like, I can have this in my collection, but if I never play it, what's the point? This is one that hits that sweet spot of, I'll keep this, and even if I play it once, twice a year, that's enough for me. It'll be easy to jump back into any time because the rules are fairly simple, but it will still offer that depth. There's just a lot to like, and I don't really have anything quite like it with that shared board piggybacking off each other's stuff and the card mechanics. Really cool stuff.
Yeah, I think you did a good job explaining everything about it. What I'll add from my perspective is I definitely like this less than you, but for very, very specific reasons that are just hold it back. It would probably end up being a play for me, but it would be closer to being a skip, but not not a skip in the sense that I would ever turn down a game about it, which is probably why it still ends up as a play.
Right.
It's more just the things that make it tough for me to get excited about Faiyum. For how much unique it does, I should be more excited. And the reasons I'm not is I really don't like the artwork.
Yeah, I knew that was an issue for you.
It's just
I can't play ugly games with Dylan.
No, and that's not ones that are potentially upwards of 3 hours long.
Yeah, fair enough.
For a long experience like that.
I don't think it would regularly take 3, but yes, our first play was definitely close to 3.
Well, I feel like our second play was 2.5 as well. It was a longer,
probably,
right?
yeah.
For a longer experience.
It's because it's that glossary.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah. So the glossary, the length, the artwork, and then the biggest one for me, and this one I could change over time. I would have to play it more. Is I found that the last time we played it, what I loved about Faiyum in the first place was what you said. You create these little mini engines for yourself, where essentially you're based on the cards that I've picked up, or whatever. Here's how I'm going to be able to be effective this game, and these are the cards I'm going to try to be bringing back to my hand, and this is what I'm going to try to do every turn. And I can't remember. I don't think I won the last game, but I had a good score. I think it was very close. I think there was a tie at the end or something.
Yeah, I think it was a tiebreaker.
Yeah, it was a very close game. I was very competitive, but I actually didn't find that the engine I had was enjoyable to do. It just made sense to do it because that was going to get me the most points. But I was doing this essentially the same thing every turn with very minor adjustments. I can't remember exactly at this point because it was a while ago that we played what that engine was, but I remember that I only really needed 3 cards or 4 cards to do what I needed to do, and I would kind of flip and add another one in here and there. But otherwise, I was really just creating this, doing this, like over and over and over again. So it was effective. It was a good engine. Maybe it could be like, oh, you did a good job in getting those cards to do that. But I actually didn't find it to be that interesting or enjoyable to do it. And so what I wonder is, how often is that going to be the case for me with Faiyum? Is that like I'm already not enjoying looking at the artwork and everything very, very much, and then potentially, even though it's an interesting design space and I might be like winning the game or being competitive, if I'm not enjoying the engine I've created for myself, and that's the essence of the game, am I really enjoying the game, I guess is what I'm coming back to. So I want to play it more. I won't turn down a game of it, but I just am not convinced it's going to be one that I'm like, oh yes, I do want to keep coming back to it like long term, or I want to have it in my collection or whatever.
That's totally fair. And I'll say a couple of things to that real quick. The first is that when I say it's own it and has the, I'm happy to have it in my collection to play a couple times a year, I want to stress, I don't think this is a game that has the replay value of like Agricola, Race for the Galaxy, these other classic games that I've played, 100 plus times.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is, like, even if I only end up playing this 30, 40 times, I feel like with the exploration of the cards, like I would be satisfied enough from that. And the other thing I was going to say is, because there's so many cards in the deck, and we've only played it twice, and I think everything I've heard about this game has, like, really, I do think the player count makes a huge difference here, because I don't think the fun in the game is finding an engine and using the same one over again. I think it's having to adapt constantly, and with 4 or 5 players, the place gets more crowded, and I think you're forced to adapt way more often. So here's what I'll say is, I don't want to play this again with 3 next time. Next time we play it, we have to play it with 4 or 5. Especially now that I know that your long-term willingness to play it might hinge on this next time we play. So next time we play, we'll play it with 5, and maybe you'll report back on the channel or in the Discord and let people know if it's changed your mind at all. But
I do respect the design space a lot, and I do find a lot of it interesting, but there's a lot of questions I still have about my long-term.
For sure. And again, absolutely totally valid, because again, this guy, the mad scientist, doesn't always smooth over all the edges of his games, Sometimes creativity and unique design comes with maybe a couple flaws along the way. But nothing like it in my collection, so that is why I doesn't own it for me. That is Faiyum.
All right, last one. This is a biggie. I feel like a lot of people are going to be interested to hear about this one.
Yeah, I wish you guys could have seen my reaction actually when Dylan told me he was covering this before he saw it. Was it was?
This is Root. Root came out in 2018. I can't say anything about Root that hasn't already been said somewhere else in terms of.
Well, thanks for watching, everyone.
So we're done. Root is a asymmetrical game. I was going to say asynchronous. Asymmetrical game where you have factions that play vastly differently from each other, and you're competing on a shared board that has a bunch of different woodland territories everywhere, and you're moving around this board. You're vying for spaces, but it's not even always. I was like, you look at it, and a lot of what you're doing is you're battling and kind of having control, like an area control game. But that's generally not, in my experience, how you win. Like every faction kind of has a different way that they're scoring points, a different way that they win. One faction wants to build a lot of buildings and score points for building them on the map. Another one is ignoring buildings completely, and you're just recovering relics as you go. That's an expansion faction, but like. Basically, which faction you choose to play with is going to impact how Root is played, what you're doing, and that to me is what ended up becoming so damn interesting about it, is that every time I've played Root, because I've used a different faction every time so far, it has felt very much like a different game, and that might be something that's imposing for a lot of people and intimidating, I guess is the better word, and a reason maybe not to play. But for me, there's so much to explore in Root, because not only can I now try all these different factions, but I can also decide I'm going to come back to a single faction, which is what one of my friends, Corbin, who's been playing the app, has been doing, and just get very, very good with that faction and find like the most effective ways to play with that faction and still have fun with it, because you haven't played that faction against this person or against this faction or against this combination of factions. So that aspect of it, combined with the deck of cards that you're playing, where you can as a sort of a multi-use card thing going on, where you can play the card for its actual ability that's on there, or you can use it for other things as well, or there's actual cards that actually give you completely different victory conditions. Like you can have these cards that you can use for the symbols that are on them, or they can go into play, and they're called dominance cards, and they go into play, and you can now claim one of those at some point and basically remove your point token from the board. You no longer score points. You just have a single way to win the game. So if you're falling behind, or if you find that like, oh, this faction's done a really good job of gaining territory, I don't want to compete with them, you can compete with them in a completely different way and force them to now kind of come after you and defend what you're trying to do there. So Root is a dense game. Like, there's no way I can possibly. I guess when I said what can I say that no one else has said, like, it's more about like trying to explain like how the game is played. Like, this is a really quick overview. I could spend half an hour trying to explain like how Root's played, and because of all the different factions and ways you play. But what it comes down to is, if you are going to be able to have a group of players, and I don't just mean like the same group before. I'm talking like if you know like say 6-7 people to play board games, and between those 6-7 people, you can always find a combination of 2, 3, 4 people that are going to want to play Root, and they all know the rules. This is an emphatic own for me now, and it took me a bit to get there. And I for a while I thought I was going to think Root was overrated because of how much it was talked about. But I think that's really what it comes down to, is if you are going to have people that are going to remember the rules, you don't have to teach it every time you bring it out. And not only that, but they're going to not only just know the rules, but know the factions well enough to get better with them and compete with them, and really kind of get into the meta of the game. This is a game that it gives back so much for what you kind of the time investment that you put into it.
Yeah, there aren't many games out there where you could say like you could just own this one game for like a few years, and like if your group is really into it, you'd probably be fine with that. You'd probably be happy with just playing the same game over and over.
Yeah, we got this sent to us by Leader Games with an expansion, and so we have the four base ones here, and we played the I think it was the Marauder expansion. We played.
I haven't played Marauder yet.
Right, sorry.
I've only played base game once.
I played both the factions in there, and I played them in a 4-player setting as well, which was really fun, and loved it so much that I already have another expansion now. So we've got the Underworld expansion. We're going to be exploring those, and I imagine I'm eventually just going to own them all, because now part of the fun is also just diving in to see how different each faction is, which ones my favorites are going to be. If someone else is choosing the Vagabond, like what is my response to be like, okay, well in this case I think I want to take the River Folk, or I want to take the Woodland Alliance, or whatever the case may be. That it becomes a whole other like game. Do you guys decide your factions all separately without telling each other first, like so people can't respond? Like there's just so much to dig into a Root, but it's all so positive for me. And that's, I guess, it started off being this daunting thing where I thought I'll never have time to properly appreciate Root, so everyone talks about it, but how could it ever crack my top 50? How could it ever be a game that I love? Because when am I going to have time to do this?
Yeah.
And now what's happened is we're basically meeting like once a month to play Root, myself, my friend Corbin, and his partner and his friend, because we love it so much. Like it's just, once you get into you cross a certain barrier, and it just becomes this really addictive game to play, and you actually do get competitive with it. And I'm not someone who gets competitive with board games all that often, but with Root I feel like I do, and it's
you have
fun
to play that competitively.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
Also, I want to add one thing real quick, just because you mentioned up to 4 players. I think with the expansions you can play up to 6. Is it?
Oh yeah, I think you,
okay,
or 5 or 6. 5.
Yeah, it's
definitely over
6,
4. Yeah. And I don't know if I'd want. I'd like to try it to see what it's like.
But you don't know if
I don't think that would be something I'd gravitate towards. But at 4, I will say we played it. We only played it at 4. I was gonna say I thought we played it with. Or no, sorry, I played it 3 and 4, and I played it 4 multiple times with just 3 once.
Haven't tried it with 2 yet, eh?
No, I haven't tried it with 2. I don't know that I'd be super interested to try it with 2.
There's very mixed things. I know there's some people who swear by it and say they love it with 2.
Right.
I don't remember which other channel we watched. It might be Foster Meeple. Don't quote me on that. But yeah. So it might be worth checking out with 2 at some point.
But at 3 and 4, it was great with both. But 4 especially, there was just so much going on, and even though there was so much going on, I never felt overwhelmed. Like it was interesting. I was excited by other people's turns to see what they were doing, because it's how's the board going to change before it gets back to me? Are they going to, like, even though it's their turn, they're interacting with my characters on the board, they're stopping what I'm doing, they're changing their victory conditions, they're drawing cards. Sometimes their abilities take items off my board or give me cards. Like there's so much happening still that involves me, that it's not one of those games that you kind of like your turn's over and you're sitting there going like, well, now I gotta wait, and these people have analysis paralysis, it's gonna take a while to get back to me. Like there's always something going on that I'm invested in, which I think is important for a 4-player game that is this involved. Otherwise you can feel like, there's a lot of downtime, right?
Yeah.
So for me, like the reason I'm saying it's an emphatic own is I want to stress like how much of an own it really is for me. Like I am fully on board with Root now. It's not my number 1 game of all time or anything. Like I don't want to make it oversell it too much here, but it's one that I am so excited to come back to multiple times. I'm really excited to play more with you, because I'm pretty confident that I will always like Root more than you.
I think so too.
But I'm curious to see if once you've played like 3 times or 4 times, and you've played it with 4 and you've played it with 3, where it kind of ends up for you. I'm curious if it ends up being more than you expect because you start to really buy into like, oh, I really want to try this faction, or oh, that was such a different experience than this faction, or whether you're like, I just don't ever want to give that kind of time investment to Root, and I'm not feeling the return or whatever. But
yeah, it's one of those things like, okay, obviously Cole Worley makes some of the like our review for Oath was literally called the most interesting game we've ever played, and to me it still stands as the most interesting game we've ever played. So, and we tried Oath before Root, so even though ever since Root came out, I knew it wasn't a game that I was gonna absolutely love. Never felt the need to own myself. Just the idea of a war game, like obviously the art makes you feel like it's not a war game, but it is a war game. Like, and that's why I was surprised that you liked it as much. And that's why I want to ask you is if this was just like had like real soldiers and was just like a war game set in Europe or whatever, but all the actual, like you still had asymmetric, like they all played the exact same way, but it was on a map of somewhere in the world with just like plain old artwork. Do you think you would like it as much?
Probably not, because it's funny because I don't actually consider myself someone that is like that I always prioritize theme over gameplay. I always one of our favorite YouTube channels is Thinker Themer, and ever since they kind of came into the space, we found ourselves, or at least I have, considering like, oh, where would I land on that debate with certain games? Like, am I more of a thinker or themer? And I've always kind of thought that I am more of a thinker, where I can kind of just ignore the theme in some cases. But in Root's case specifically, there's something about the theme and the colorfulness and the playfulness and the attractiveness of it that makes it so much easier to learn each faction and kind of learn the way that they play and get into it than if it was like a World War II theme and I'm learning about the English faction or whatever, and reading. I'd be way less invested and feel way less of a pull to be like, okay, I'm gonna like really learn this faction. Whereas with Root, it's been really interesting to be like, oh yes, okay, like the way that this faction plays, like they would be the moles or they would be the cats or whatever. Like it's just that really interesting integration of that theme, and it makes it so much more inviting to get into. And the other thing I really want to stress is once you have learned Root and your group that you're playing with, or your group of like the people that you're eventually going to have in the game in some fashion have learned it, and you're not doing rules overhead, the fact that this game can play in like 60 minutes is such a huge selling feature. At that point, getting together and being like, yeah, we play Root once a month or whatever, and you sit down, you start at 7 and everyone's, has left or is at home by 9, like,
or you just play another game of Root or something else.
Like that ups it even more, because then it doesn't have to be the only thing you play in it. Like the first time we played, I think it was like a 3.5-hour game, right? Like,
I think it was, well, maybe with the teach, but once we started playing, I remember being so surprised by how quick I remember thinking like, oh, after the teach, it's probably going to be like 3-4 hours for the first time. And I think after the teach, it was maybe like 2 to 2.5. And I remember thinking for the amount of times, like, I myself was like, sorry, what is that? What does your faction do again? What is that? Like, we did have to do quite a bit of rules clarification, but I remember thinking like, man, we could probably play that in like 60 to 90 minutes, which is a huge achievement for this type of game. That, along with the fact that the asymmetry works as well as it does, is like, it's a huge achievement in game design. Like, I've only played it once, so I don't know I'm nowhere near a final verdict on this, but no matter what I end up thinking of this, it'll be one of the most impressively designed games I've played, just because the amount of thought and probably like play testing and balance work and just so much stuff that went into this game to make it work while still being like colorful and thematic and inviting and stuff is really, really impressive. I will say the one main thing that's holding me back from liking this game more, and again, only one play so far, so very, very, very first impression kind of thing. There were more turns than I would like in the game, and I might have mentioned this on the channel before, where I felt like not that the best decision was obvious, like not that it was an easy move, but that after enough, like a minute or two, figuring out that there was one move that was definitely by far better than the other moves, and it was just a matter of me being able to spot it. And so like, and I wonder, part of me is wondering if when I play the game more, is that going to become so obvious that I get to know the factions so well that I look at the board and go, oh, well, like 80% of the options available to me right now would be completely foolish, because if I either go here, I'll do this, or I'll go here, those are strong ones. The game we played, I'll say I played the easiest faction, I kind of got lucky and won, and at the end, for a game that's like this war game, we're competing against each other, I didn't feel like I made like a particularly clever play to win the game. I just looked at the board full and I was like, oh, there's only one thing I can do to have a chance at winning, and if I don't win, they're going to win. So I'll do that thing, and then I did the dice roll, and the odds were in my favor. It was 60, 70%, whatever. I did the dice roll, and I won, and I just went, oh, well, like, it was kind of an obvious last move, and I just didn't feel that like, yeah, I overcame, this difficult thing. So I just want to see if is the decision space going to feel less restrictive? Are the moves going to feel less like, hey, this is what you have to do to win, or this is what you have to do to stop this other player, otherwise they're going to win? I like a bit more freedom, but again, only one play.
And what I will say, and totally valid, what I will say that I think is cool about that is that honestly might be more of a case of that just not being the faction for you than it is the not being the game for you, because there are other factions that I've played, especially in the Marauder expansion, that or even just the Woodland Alliance in the base game, that the decision space and how hard it is, because you start the game so far, you don't even start on the board, like you start the game so far behind in that sense, but ramp up so much when you're on the board, that it's so interesting to kind of see like how you're going to get onto the board, how you're going to win the game, how you're going to be viable and everything, that it might just be that for you specifically, and in this case that's probably going to ping you because it's the orange cat pieces.
I know, they're orange and they're cats. I said that right when we sat down, like, this is made for me.
But it might just be that faction is just not an interesting faction for you.
Could be.
Where when you play another one, you'll be like, oh my god, like when I play root with this faction, I love it. When I play root with this faction, it's meh. And like,
yeah, that's why I want to see the expansion factions, because even the Eerie feels to me like, okay, it's telling you have this decree, so you have to do the thing that it's telling you to do, because why would you do the thing that puts you in revolt or whatever it's called? So it just feels like it's giving you options that you obviously would never take. So you're just like, every turn feels like this process of elimination. What are the things that I'm obviously not going to do? Rule those out, and then between the 2, 3, 4 potentially good options, which one am I picking?
Right.
But I need to try the other factions.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it'll take a couple more plays for you to know for sure, and it'll probably take a couple of plays with like you playing with myself and like someone like Corbin or Raj who has played multiple times as well.
Absolutely.
To also feel challenged and like they're really stopping me from doing what I need to do and having to like make better decisions and stuff.
For sure.
So.
And I have the digital version, so I'm gonna get in like 2 or 3 more plays at least, and then we'll play it in person again. We should I definitely want to play it at least a couple more times. I think it's going to be a game where once I explore all the factions, I'm probably going to be like, I'm good on root. Like, not that I wouldn't, not that I would refuse it, but that like that's what I want to do. I want to see all the factions, and then if I like it still the same amount as I do, I'll probably be fine on it.
Yeah, and then there'll be me, which every time they do another crowdfunding campaign for another expansion, now I'm gonna be back in every single one.
And eventually over time we'll just start gaming together less and less and less as you go off with your little root group. No, just kidding. Into the woodland forest, never to return.
But it's funny because I understand way more now why there are channels out there that either can be well, even like Lord of the Board and Quackalope, like a lot of what they did at the start was they got popular because of doing root videos, right? Like, and they honed in on doing it with this faction or this player count or whatever, and I it's not that I didn't understand that, but I was just like, wow, how is
you're like, what is it about
popular,
this game?
Right? But I get it now. Like, I get it. I get root, and I enjoy root now, and I'm actually really excited to see like how much I end up enjoying root, like where it slots in. But I can guarantee you, it's on my top 50 now. I just don't know where it's going to end up in this year, next year, whatever. It'll take a lot more exploring, a lot more factions for you to know for sure.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I think no matter what, we probably both agree that it fully deserves its place on the BGG 100, because even if it might not end up being the game for me, super impressive design.
Super impressive. That is root.
And that's it. I feel like we could chat about root all day. There's so much to say about this game.
I want to chat about root.
I know. I'll turn off the camera. No. Those are our 6 games. Thank you so much for watching. As always, let us know what you think. Do you stand differently on any of these games if you've played them, or are there any of these that you maybe didn't know about before that caught your eye? Let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.